live. Let me just double check here.
All right.
And yes, it looks like we are good to go. All right. Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks, Jason, for joining us and spending some time talking about what's happening in the education landscape around analytics and learning analytics, what's happening in terms of how the tools and the software are being developed and the impact that that's having on other individuals or academics, particularly that are trying to use analytics for their own learning activities and so on. So by way of introduction, Jason's been critical in helping get the presence of Tableau addressed in this particular course, and so it's been something that has been quite valuable for our end. So a lot of students have taken advantage of downloading the software and have had a chance to start working with it. And so why don't we just start by a quick introduction, Jason? What do you do with Tableau?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me, George. I really do appreciate it. So over at Tableau, I run the academic programs at Tableau. And so a lot of what that entails is I work on getting Tableau in the hands of students and educators. And my goal there is really to help develop the next generation of analysts who are going to be working with data and working with analytical programs. And so what we want to do at Tableau is we want to open up kind of the pool of tools available to anyone who wants to work with them. And so I end up administering a few different programs over here that focus on giving free access to Tableau to students and instructors. And in addition to that, I end up doing a bit of training at schools and universities to be able to help people out with learning Tableau in the first place.
Okay, great. Now, one of the things, so I'll give you a little bit of an overview with where we're at in the course. So the first week, we really spent time looking at what learning analytics are and trying to define learning analytics and gave learners a chance to sort of get comfortable with the range of different topic areas and what role analytics might play educationally. This week, we've turned to looking at the data cycle, finding, collecting, working with, cleaning data. We had a guest speaker in earlier in the week, Tony Hurst, who talked about this idea of data wrangling and developing these skill sets and abilities to mess around with data and to be driven by inquisitive or curious views of what kind of insight we can gain from data. The bulk of the week, though, is individuals spending time looking specifically at educational data, relying on, in a portion of this week at least, some of the tutorials that are available on the Tableau site. And so they've had a chance to look into the Getting Started video, which is a nice introduction to what Tableau is and does, how simple it is for individuals to start working with. And then there's been a couple of the other videos identifying getting started with data, data formats, formatting it for importing into Tableau and to start working with it. So that's where we're at with the course. Now, what I'd like to hear from you is, first of all, a couple quick things. How do you define analytics or learning analytics or academic analytics in the education landscape?
I mean, I probably end up. I mean, I would say that I'm coming into this conversation as more of a layperson than yourself, most definitely. I define education analytics and learning analytics as anything that ends up helping enhance the understanding of how students are learning, or how students, or I guess how students are learning, or how they end up going about the process of learning. So either a kind of objective-focused outcome or kind of a process-focused approach. So I mean, that's how I would talk about it.
And are you finding also, so one of the things that has come up briefly, we haven't gotten into great detail with it so far because we're just getting initiated with the tools and working with it. So obviously there's one aspect that has happened, or at least an impact from the education landscape, is that the tools we're using, early generation at least, have sort of a business intelligence focus. They've been incorporated from what's happened in the corporate space, or they've been incorporated from projects that have been successful in government organizations and so on. And so when individuals first start thinking about analytics in learning, there's this sense that it's like, well, that's business intelligence applied to education. And when you and I had a brief chat earlier this week, you mentioned that in Tableau, or from your end at least, you see sort of two dimensions to education analytics. One related to the organizational, so almost academic analytics, how you start doing a better job in a university organizing some of your resources, and the second that relates to the educational data specifically with the learner. And your recent response, you talked about the learner experience, for definition, helping the learner do better in their learning experience. What kinds of things would you see that from an academic end? So university, college, school leaders, in your work with Tableau, how are you seeing those individuals use Tableau?
So I think there's an overarching point of how people are starting to use Tableau, and this is related, I think, to just there's an overall transformation in the landscape. I think there's an idea of Tableau becoming and coming into the world of old school business intelligence. And so, I mean, you mentioned that business intelligence is really that old way of looking at working with data. And I think that a lot of companies and educational organizations are facing the challenge of coming out of thinking about data as something that's intrinsically aligned with business intelligence. And so whether it's, I mean, we're talking both about how people end up using Tableau in school as students, as educators, or also as administrators to be able to understand what their schools are doing. And they're all coming from this perspective of business intelligence being this kind of unapproachable place to be in unless you're this expert. And so I think that regardless of where you're at in the education realm, there's the challenge that you're coming out of this place where analytics is arcane. Analytics is difficult to do. Analytics is unapproachable. And so that's a lot of the transformation that we've seen recently over the past, I would say probably most significantly over the past 2 or 3 years. And a lot of this is tied with academic organizations. I mean, they're starting to face the pains of not being able to understand what their data is saying, and so they're maybe a little bit behind where other companies and industry are in terms of being able to understand their data or even be able to ask it questions. I mean, so much of what they might be trying to do is wrangle with their data. But I think that what we're seeing also in schools with educators teaching with Tableau is kind of twofold. It's one, an approach of students wanting to learn skills that are being asked for in the marketplace right now. And Tableau, and I would say, I mean, the broader point is visualization tools are very applicable. They're very relevant, and I think that they're especially relevant to this generation of high school and college students right now. Because, I mean, just of the rise of kind of data-driven infographics. And so data visualization is a cool thing, and I love that it's coming about to become this. So there's a little bit of that kind of job-focused motivation going on, but there's also the motivation to be able to actually start working with data and to be able to understand information in what might only be a 12-week class session. And so that is traditionally a little bit difficult when you're working with tools that require a lot of front loading in terms of knowledge of how to work with the tool itself. And so a lot of classes have been structured in such a way that they teach one tool, then they move on, then they'll teach another tool, and then so on and so forth. And so what a lot of people who have been working with Tableau say is that they really don't have to teach with the tool. And so this is the benefit, is that students can start working with some actual data, and they can end up learning a tool through the use of understanding data and information. So those are a couple of the ways that that split kind of works within kind of administration and then teaching itself.
Okay, and one of the things you mentioned a couple of times was data and working with data, and I think by background for learners in the course, I've mentioned this a few times as well during the discussion forums and other areas, but we selected Tableau specifically because it allowed us to demonstrate activity with data without requiring specialized scripting language the way that is often required when you're working with certain types of analytics tools. So Tableau was selected because it was an opportunity for learners to begin doing basic things with data without necessarily having very complex technical skills. And with Tableau, then, one of the things that you've certainly started to do is build out the connections with other data tool sets, whether it's Tableau working with R, or whether it's Tableau that's working with direct connection to MongoDB or other types of tool sets, so that you're building value for end users to still stay in a fairly comfortable visual structure and environment, but having the opportunity to enhance functionality with something that might be looked at as a pure data science type of tool. So with that end, though, there's that one thing that keeps coming up, which is data and access to data. And one of the assignments the students are tasked with this week is to start looking for educational data. Now, there's a range of opportunities available, but I'd like to hear from you. I mean, if you were to say, if somebody came up to you and said, Jason, I'm starting to use Tableau, but I don't have a clue where I'm going to get data to start experiencing these kinds of, I mean, I saw the sales visualization in the Getting Started video, but how do I actually start finding educational data that I can bring in, or where would you send somebody who wants to work with data educationally?
I mean, it's a it's a fantastic question. It's a big question. I think that one of the big places that we see people working with data commonly in education is with IPEDS data. And so within the U.S., I mean, this is kind of the gold standard of data that universities need to work with when they're trying to understand things like incoming classes and demographics. So that's pardon me. So that's part of the first place that I would end up going. I'd go to the public types of data sources that end up dealing with things like admissions data, that end up showing kind of the broad scope demographic data related to education. Some of the other things that are useful, so you mentioned data wrangling earlier, and I think that that's very relevant because so much of the data that we end up trying to work with or wanting to work with is difficult in the form that it's provided. And so a lot of the challenge there, I think, when I work with classes, for example, I work with classes at the University of Washington, for instance, where we end up doing we do 4-hour Tableau workshops, and probably about 80% of the questions in those workshops is how do I reformat this data that I found online that I want to use, but it's coming in Tableau in this wonky way because it's not formatted properly, and I need to pivot it or unpivot it or something like that. So one of the ways that we can kind of get around a little bit of that wonky data part is there are some examples that I can send over to you, George, that we can end up providing to everyone afterwards. That are some ways, it's some education data that's been randomized. So it's not personally identifiable, but it is real data that we've gotten from different institutions. And so this data deals with things along the lines of rankings, admissions, deals with a little bit of kind of space management even on the administrative side. And so it deals with a few different of those use cases. And so that data itself is very clean. That data is formatted well. And it's going to play well with Tableau as a result of it. And so that's something that I would recommend that people at least take a look at as kind of a first step. But it's a great question, and I don't have a fully complete answer for you in terms of how to find the best data out there.
Great, and so a few things. And the only reason I was asking is one of the assignments, as I mentioned this week, is for learners to find and begin working with data. And I suggested a few sites that would be of interest. Obviously, IPEDS. For those of you that are interested, that's IPEDS. If you haven't encountered it before, but just simply Google, you'll have a range of opportunities. The U.S. Department of Education, the data.gov. There's a range of educational resources there. There's also OECD data that can be used. World Bank. A variety of sources where you can access just enough data to start playing with, basically. And that's what we're trying to do is, for this assignment, you're going to start as we move through the course, and eventually you'll play with a couple of different tools that will get you working better with unstructured data. But for now, at least, before we dive into some of those additional processes, you'll find, from a learner perspective, helpful to be able to get a hold of just some small data. They don't have to be huge. They can just be some basic tables that you can create, in some cases off the iPad site, download, bring them into Tableau, and start playing around with them. But those are a few things to look at, and Jason, I'll wait for you mentioned some clean data sets around educational data that you might be able to share as well. Those of you that are already working in a university setting, and if you have access to LMS data, or if you have access to, because when we're looking at data like enrollment trends and that's, I would typically view that a little bit more at an academic analytics end, because we're now looking at the aspect of learning that impacts the institution. The learning analytics would be a little more granular, that would get down to things such as student time on task, student frequency of login, student, the network configurations, which we'll get into next week when we talk social network analysis and so on. So anyway, I was just trying to get a few ideas from you in terms of how you would direct individuals to start working with data, and info from you I'll just post into the edX discussion forum.
Yeah, and If I mean, the one thing that I would mention also is when you have options of getting data, if you have the options of getting data in an aggregated or an unaggregated format, unaggregated is almost always going to be better because it's going to allow you more flexibility in terms of drilling down into the data. Pre-summary, basically pre-summarizing data is going to let you have one perspective, which is kind of that summarized top-level perspective. But a lot of what I expect you'll want to end up being able to do in working with this data is being able to say, hey, this looks odd. I want to look into this a little bit more. I want to drill down. I want to slice and dice this data with new dimensions or measures. And so that's only going to be possible when you have data that's a little bit lower down in terms of the granularity.
Yeah, and that's a good point as well for individuals in the course. You'll see this OECD site, they'll have a stat link option, and that's something that I've started to see more and more with different sites where if they have a particular visualization, you then have the opportunity to actually directly access the table or to access the data rather than just the visualization. If all you have is the visualization, those questions that you mentioned, Jason, where you're like, this looks interesting, you don't really have an opportunity to dive into that. So you're kind of hamstrung if you don't have the ability to actually get into and start looking at the data in particular. So that's an important concept. Another aspect, I guess, that's probably worth diving into a little bit is there's a range of ways of working with data, and it's absolutely an exploding field globally, it seems, at least if I'm to believe the hypesters, that it's one of the most easily employable work areas. Right now, I was chatting with University or North Carolina State, Michael Rappa, who runs the UNCS program on data science, and the numbers they have are staggering in terms of the students that graduate and immediately move into the workplace with significant income potential as well. So when we talk about this then from an analytics perspective, there's a lot of value in these skills. Learning analytics organizations, I've talked with universities, probably the most frequent conversation that comes up when I'm meeting with university leaders or even IT folks is, how do we get the talent? How do we get the skills for people that can start to do this? Now, Tableau is one tool, one approach to it. But if you wanted somebody just to start thinking about data science, how would you encourage someone to get involved in this field? I mean, obviously, one answer from your end as a Tableau representative is, well, get comfortable with Tableau. But some of these skills are generic. They're cross-tool sets, but it's really about sort of level of data inquisitiveness and curiosity. But what kind of direction would you provide to someone that comes up to you and wants help?
I would say that I mean, there are a lot of analytical platforms out there, Tableau being one of them, that can end up helping you kind of start working with data, but it doesn't get at the underlying. There are, I think, two underlying ideas there that are really important, and one is structure of data, and the second is being able to clean data. And so a lot of this is, I mean, I hate to say it's the unsexy part of data science. I mean, working with data is the fun part. Getting data to a point where you can actually work with it, that's the challenging part, but it's also, I mean, it's also a very, very important part there. So I think that some of the students that I've worked with, they've said that, I mean, they've gotten their foot in the door with not much more than just a background in SQL and a background in Tableau. Others, and so I mean, that's going to be for less of a data science approach, a little bit more of a data analyst approach. But I think that being able to understand structure of data and being able to grasp that beyond just getting a data set that's already pre-formatted for you and is already set up for you to work with, I think that's a very core skill. And then the other core skill is being able to manipulate data. So whether that's ending up using kind of a proprietary tool, or whether that's using Python and writing scripts to be able to reformat your data itself, I think that is a really core skill, and that's where I think the differentiation comes between kind of that data analyst role and that data scientist role. And I think that this is the challenge that schools are facing right now. It's just an amazing trend over the past couple of years, seeing how many schools are opening Masters of Science in Analytics and Masters of Science in Data Science programs. And I think that this is kind of the conceptual problem to get over is what exactly is data science, and how you define it, and how does that differ from someone who's an analyst. And so I mean, I think that whenever I end up talking with universities as well, I want them to define what they really mean by data science, because it's a very it's a very amorphous term these days.
Yeah, no, absolutely, fair enough. Okay, so one of the things, let's talk a little bit, and I've tried to emphasize here and in the forums as well, is that Tableau is a great tool to get and to get comfortable with data and to do some fairly sophisticated analysis work. The nice aspect of it is that it's end user friendly, which means that even an academic or a teacher who perhaps doesn't have the skills to dive in, or the interest. I mean, the skills can be developed fairly easily, but the interest to dive into getting into data cleaning and trying to use or collect and make sense of data effectively, but they're capable of asking questions of the data if it's in a certain reasonable quality shape, and they're capable of, as this week one of the sessions looks at story points, adding story points or narratives to your data. They're capable of understanding, it's their data in many cases. So if I teach a group of students and I find, oh, in week 3 this happened in a course, what does that mean? As a teacher in that course, I'll know what that means. And so if somebody can give me the data in a certain type of a usable format, I'll be able to drill down deeper and ask those questions. But one of the things that has come up as well, and I imagine you've probably heard this before, is Tableau is not exactly cheap in some cases. Obviously, price is relative. If you're in an organization or a corporation where you're able to do some advanced analytics, you can, in a good set of visualization and insight, it's well worth the fee. Obviously, it's assigned. Education is always grappling with dollars and concerns about dollars. What kind of programs are available for educators that maybe don't have the amount of resources available that someone in a corporate space might?
Sure. So I'll start with our free programs and then move to some of our discounted programs. The free programs are the ones that I end up running over here at Tableau. And so these programs are going to be Tableau for Teaching and Tableau for Students. And as the names kind of indicate, Tableau for Teaching is for educators who want to teach their students using Tableau, and Tableau for Students is for students directly. Those are programs that are probably tangentially related to what we're talking about here today, but that's where we end up offering our free options there. We also have Tableau Public, which is a free option for anyone to be able to work with Tableau, with the one very major caveat, which is if you want to save work in Tableau Public, it saves up to our cloud, and when it saves up to our cloud, it gets published. And so the innate downside or upside is that any information that you're working with in Tableau Public ends up becoming in the public realm. Other people can access that data, other people can work with that data, and so if you're working with public data, that's fantastic. If you're not working with public data, then it's probably not such a good option. In terms of kind of how we can also help out educators who are wanting to work with Tableau who don't fall into any of the buckets we have a couple of options in terms of education discounts. So we offer an education discount for anyone who's working in higher ed, K through 12, anyone who's working in education. And so this is just a blanket discount across the board for our products. And so that ends up bringing the price of Tableau Desktop down to, I think it's $750 for the personal edition, or $1,500 for professional. And the difference there is what you can end up connecting to, whether it's flat files or whether you want to connect to relational databases and so on and so forth. And one of the things that also is going on there is you're actually buying the software. You're not buying use for a small period of time. It's not going to end up expiring in 2 years or something like that. The software is yours, and so the price point there ends up incorporating the fact that you end up having full use of that software so long as you want to.
Okay, now that was so there's a bit of background. There's the Tableau for Teaching and Tableau for Learning is probably good options for educators that want to use Tableau in a course, but maybe don't have a budget to be able to do that. And as you mentioned, there's additional discounted approaches as well. So at least there's an option for people who, when they're finished the course, they say, I'd like to use this with a group of students. How can I do it? There's the no fee option, or the public Tableau Public option as well. So a final question then, as we're sort of wrapping up, we try and keep these sessions a bit short as well. So final question, I guess, would be related to where do you see things going educationally? I mean, what kinds of questions do you expect that educators, school systems, teachers will be able to answer through the use of analytics? That's the whole point of our course, obviously.
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think that I think a lot of schools right now and a lot of educators are working with data in kind of a historical sense. People, I think that the common approach and the easy approach is to be asking questions of data of what has happened. This is many times much better than what people have been able to do in the past already. So being able to look, see what's happened, be able to assess the success or the failure or the metrics associated with what have you. I think that as we end up having more of a focus on data and more of a focus on analytics, we're going to be moving towards a more predictive model. We're going to be incorporating tools and things like R so that we can end up actually creating predictive models to be able to assess how our students are going to be able to perform, not just how they have in the past, but how they're going to be able to in the future. And so I'm not sure how much you're planning on going into this in the course in terms of the predictive aspect, but I think that that's something that's a little bit. It takes a lot more work, and it takes a lot more expertise. But I think that that's where the gold is, as I would say, of how we can start working with data is making predictions, and being able to take a number of factors that a student comes into a class with, or a student comes into a university or school with, and be able to say, well, this person is going to be predisposed to this, this, and this, and so let's go ahead and try to adjust their educational outcomes, so that we can put them on a better path.
All right, well, and what about the role of unstructured or text data? I mean, that's something that isn't quite central right now in Tableau functioning. Is that something that you're looking at adding layers on, or don't you want to reveal too much of your product pipeline?
I mean, I think that it is no secret that the goal of Tableau as an organization is to help people work with type of data, and so one of the things that we're building into the next version of our product is an ability to clean data moderately and pivot and unpivot data, even if you haven't done it in the original data source. And so while we haven't talked as much about things like unstructured data, it's along the same thought lines. I mean, we want people to be able to work with data regardless of what it is or where it's at. There's just a little bit more of a challenge in terms of how you actually do that, in terms of parsing it into a program and building parameters around how you can actually make that function.
Okay, well, great. Thanks very much, Jason, for joining us. We're pretty much at our 30-minute timeline, so I do appreciate you taking time out of your schedule and share a bit of how you see Tableau being used or in education, and perhaps more broadly, some of the important trends going forward in educational data and analytics. So thanks again for your time, and for those of you that joined in, thanks for attending.
Thanks for having me.